Welcome to the Great Basin Smoke Dispersion Briefing for March 31st. This is Gina McGuire. Looking at the observed and percent of normal precipitation over the last 7 days, precipitation mainly fell across the eastern half of Nevada into Utah, southeast Idaho, Wyoming, and the central Idaho mountains. And this precipitation across the central portion of the Great Basin was well above normal for this last week, with below normal conditions further north and south. If we look at the water vapor satellite image for today, we see a strong ridge of high pressure has now built along the entire west, with low pressure now already dropped through the Great Basin and is dropping southeast through the southwestern U.S. If we look at how this affects the ventilation indices for today, we have very high ventilation indices across really all of the Great Basin, as we still have some stronger northerly winds across most of the area. If we look at the individual components of the ventilation index for today, we see those stronger winds over again the eastern half to 2/3 of the Great Basin with fairly high mixing heights. Now if we look at the conditions as we move into Friday, this ridge of high pressure starts to build eastward with much lower ventilation indices over the western half of the Great Basin as winds become very light under the center portion of this ridge. We still do have some breezy winds over parts of Idaho and the eastern side of Utah, which is why the ventilation index is much higher. If we look at the individual components for Friday, we can see the winds in the left-hand image are a little bit stronger again over parts of southeast Idaho into the eastern side of Utah and southwest Wyoming, along with much higher mixing heights. Moving into Saturday, this ridge of high pressure starts to flatten a little bit with a little bit more zonal flow across the northern half of the Great Basin, leading to ventilation indices that are a little bit higher. However, we still have poor dispersion really over the southern 2/3 of the Great Basin. If we look at the individual components, once again for Saturday, the transport winds show very light winds still across the southern half of the Great Basin, where these lower smoke dispersion areas were, and again the winds increased slightly over parts of Idaho into Wyoming, along with higher mixing heights. If we look at the Utah Forecast Clearing Index for Thursday, again we have very high clearing indices over much of the central Utah mountains up in northern Utah with those stronger winds today. However, as we move through Friday, we see a much lower clearing index across all of the state, and then still remaining over the western areas where those lighter winds will remain on Saturday. However, over the eastern half of Utah, smoke dispersion will increase. If we look at the overall forecast amount of precipitation through Sunday afternoon, we see really only very light amounts of precipitation across the Great Basin, mainly in parts of the Sierra and across Idaho and Wyoming. Now looking at the extended outlook starting Sunday and going through the early part of next week, this ridge of high pressure continues to move eastward with some moisture moving up over the northern portion of the Great Basin and still very good ventilation indices across Nevada with poorer dispersion as you move further north and east. Moving into Monday, a trough moves into the Pacific Northwest, and this will bring some precipitation to the northern areas of the Great Basin along with breezier winds, allowing for a little bit better smoke dispersion over parts of Nevada and Utah. However, still we have very poor dispersion over parts of Idaho into Wyoming. Moving into Tuesday, this trough of low pressure dips southeast over the eastern side of the Great Basin with a little bit stronger northerly winds to northwest winds over Nevada and Idaho with again increased dispersion. However, ventilation indices will decrease over the eastern portion of Utah. Moving into Wednesday, we see an area of low pressure now developing off the Baja Peninsula, which will move north and bring more significant precipitation to the area by the middle of the week. However, we still have ridging in place for Wednesday, with generally northeast to easterly wind flow, which may still be somewhat breezy at the surface, leading to higher ventilation indices across Nevada and Utah. Moving further north and east, and dispersion starts to decrease. Looking at the overall forecast amount of precipitation from Sunday through Tuesday next week, we see again the bulk of the precipitation is forecast over the northern portion of the Great Basin, with the more significant precipitation amounts in the central Idaho mountains. However, again, as we move through later next week, we'll see greater amounts of precipitation moving up from the south. Looking at the 8 to 14 day outlook, you can see on the right, as we already mentioned, that precipitation expected later next week across the southern portion of the Great Basin, and we are expecting above normal precipitation with still warm temperatures. That concludes our briefing for today. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us. Thank you for listening.